Jeff would know some really good ones. There you go. You're going to close it for us. That's great. Are we almost ready there, Patrick? Okay. All right. Thumbs up. Well, greetings. Welcome to Meetinghouse Church. Welcome to our first Faith and Justice event of the season. We're going to have another Faith and Justice event that will occur on October 29th, where we're going to be participating in what's known as Sacred Sites Tour, which is led by Jim Bear Jacobs. If you're interested in that, please do check out our website for information on that. I'm going to introduce our speaker and talk just a little brief bit about what she's going to talk about, and then just turn it over to her because everyone I know is excited to hear what she has to say about this. But I did want to say something about Faith and Justice. The Faith and Justice Forum really began, it certainly has antecedents in the life of this community, this church, but it certainly was, I think, fueled in many ways by what happened in the summer of 2020 in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the uprising here in the cities. And the idea was simply that people of faith are also people who should be, or at the very least, maybe they're interested in being also committed to justice. And justice here not simply being, sort of the classical to each what they deserve, but rather access to a flourishing life. So that's what we mean when we talk about justice, that justice is access to a flourishing life, and faith clearly should commit and be connected to that. So welcome. My name is Christian Collinswin. I'm the teaching minister here and a colleague of our speaker tonight. I'm super excited to introduce her. In order not to go too long, I have all this stuff on paper, and also to avoid getting teary-eyed, which is a thing that I do. So first, I'm just going to read this if you'll kind of follow along with me. So Sara Wilhelm Garbers was born and raised in the Twin Cities and came of age in church plants connected to the Baptist General Conference, part of the evangelical fundamentalist movement. A child of the 80s and daughter of the moral majority, Sara, and she's got some interesting stories about Focus on the Family I'm sure she'd be happy to share. Sara grew up in deeply Christian nationalist contexts and has spent a lifetime wrestling with the issues that she is presenting on tonight. Her undergraduate work was at the University of Minnesota, where she graduated magna cum laude with a communications and women's studies degree, a bachelor's. After a year in Nashville, Sara returned to Minnesota, where she received an MDiv in 2011 from Bethel Seminary. And after working at Luther Seminary, Sara started her doctoral studies at Loyola University of Chicago. During her studies, she was also working as a full-time minister, first at First Covenant in Minneapolis, and then here at Meetinghouse Church. Sara is proud to have given birth or helped to midwife 3 different things over this past year. Number 1 is Josie, the human. That's how she talks to her. That's how she calls her, Josie the human. Number 2 is her dissertation, which was completed and defended in June. And then our new church name, Meetinghouse Church, which of course she was a part of that process for this whole community. Anyone who knows Sara knows that she's passionate about the issue she's going to speak about tonight, and that she's fiercely committed to people and to communities, and in particular to seeing that those folks who are in those communities, those peoples, that they experience genuine freedom. She sometimes calls herself a midwife of freedom. Sara has partnered with a wonderful human named Andy, and together they are parenting Josie and their sweet dog Blue. Tonight, Sara is going to be sharing some aspects of her dissertation research, helping us to understand what is Christian nationalism. What do we mean when we use this term? I'm sure you've heard it in the media. And this is, I think, the most important thing, why the calling to follow Jesus or to become an authentically Christian person or community is fundamentally a call to exit Christian nationalism in all of its forms. So please join me in welcoming Sara as she shares with us her talk, Jesus versus Christian Nationalism.
Hello. Hi. First of all, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's here, both in person and online. It is not lost on me that there are so many things that we can do with our lives, and that you have taken the time and space to share some of your life with me tonight, and that we can gather in this way means so much. Since this is not my dissertation defense, and we're in a church context, I'm going to ask if you would pray with me as we start off, okay? Let's pray together. God of all life and love, pray that even this night that you would meet us, that there might be some thoughts or ideas that maybe we hadn't considered, including me, that would open us more deeply to the reality of who you are. In the text of the Christian faith, we are reminded that God is love. Might you meet us with that love this night, and might indeed that kingdom of love be that which, whatever our faith is, that it is something that we all together are committed to. Amen. Amen. Well, like any good work, you start off a dissertation or a book or anything with some acknowledgments and some thanks. And as I thanked you all for being here tonight, I just want to name some special thanks to the folks who made this possible. It wouldn't have been possible without this community, and I think particularly of the moderators and Jeff and the rest of the staff and community. I feel called to be a midwife of freedom. This community has helped to midwife me in becoming the person that I am today, so I'm so grateful for that. I'm also so grateful just for family and friends, for Andy, as you heard, etc. For Greg and Linda, who are my adopted parents, the way they have held space at the cabin and had to wonder for years if I would ever finish a dissertation. To my director, Hilla Hawker, and to all the educators and mentors and colleagues and friends who have brought me here to this place. Happened that really, this is an effort as a labor of love, about what it means for us to, as diverse people, sing together a song of life and love and justice. As the title of the talk for tonight belies, I have a particular position and perspective that I'm going to be sharing about tonight. And it's one in which I believe that the call to follow Jesus and what that invites of and from us is in a critical relationship with the operation of Christian nationalism. Okay, I'm going to say more about all of that, so if that one sentence lost you for a second, just hang in there. We'll keep going. I will define a little bit for us tonight. What do I mean when I say Christian nationalism? Christian nationalism has become more of a buzzword in our kind of current political conversations and in the media. But what do I mean by that? And then in doing that, I'm going to situate some of the work that I was exploring in my dissertation, and a tradition that I think helps us to situate the modern conversation around Christian nationalism in a longer discourse. And then I'm going to bring forward some things that I've been wrestling with as I've been thinking about what does it mean to be Christian? How do we become church? What does that look like in our time? And then we'll have some space for conversation and dialogue as we go forward. So, to the piece of defining Christian nationalism. On your handout you should have received, it's also in the comments there. Christian nationalism, as quoting here the work of Whitehead and Perry, which is also listed on the back of the sheet with a few different resources for further reading if you want to explore more. In their book, they write about it. Christian nationalism is a cultural framework, a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealizes and advocate a fusion of Christianity and American civic life. It includes assumptions of nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and heteronormativity, along with divine sanction for authoritarian control and militarism. It is as ethnic as it is political, as it is religious. Understood in this light, Christian nationalism contends that America has been and always should be distinctively, and I would say also universally, Christian. Okay. So Christian nationalism, in so many ways, is about this sense of that since it's the beginning founding of our country that America was Christian. And that there is a tension at play that we see throughout our discourse and history about Christian nationalism and what it means for us to be American. I want to make a couple things clear about where I'm coming from in this perspective. To say that I think Jesus is against Christian nationalism does not mean that I think God hates America. Doesn't mean that I think Christians need to hate America. I think we can be deeply, deeply patriotic people. I think we can serve in the military. I think we can support U.S. troops. But part of what I want to talk about tonight is a concern, and a historic concern, about what happens when Christianity gets too wedded with the political power establishment. And when, as Christians, we start to think that our task and job is to ensure that the law of the land is a Christian law or a Christian land. And I want us to take some time to see why I think it's necessary that we tease those things apart. Now, some of you may already think that, and you might be like, move on. But we're going to stick with that for a minute. In the work that Whitehead and Perry and others have taken up, they followed the Baylor Religion Survey. And it's a survey that looks at how people respond to a set of 6 different questions. They ask people to respond to, do you think that the federal government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation? Yes or no, or in between, where are you? Should the federal government advocate for Christian values? Yes, no, maybe. Should the federal government enforce a strict separation between church and state? Should they allow the public display of religious symbols in public spaces or not? And then people are also asked to respond to, do you believe that the success of the U.S. is part of God's plan? How about, should the government make there be prayer in schools? So according to these 6 different questions, people respond across the board. And they've been following this, Baylor has, for many years, to look at what are U.S. attitudes and responses. Not shockingly, people have different opinions, right? Okay. So those folks who would advocate strongly that they believe that the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, that would be a yes to Christian nationalism, okay? Someone might say, I am super Christian, but I don't think the government should declare us a Christian nation, right? That would say I'm Christian, but not Christian nationalist. Okay. Does that make sense, kind of as we're going? Okay. So those are the categories that they're exploring. And the book, for instance, by Whitehead that I have in the reference list, they follow the data from the Baylor Religious Studies. Now, for me, the question, and coming to this, really is a personal one, like Christian was naming. I was born in the 80s. And in my community of faith, to be Christian was to be Republican. And it was very clear in my community that we believed, not only we wanted to see that the Republican Party would actually align completely with the values that we believed. Okay? And within that, and in the context, for instance, there was a deep sense that God wanted us to be the new Israel. That the United States, since its founding, that was the objective of who we were supposed to be. And there was a deep commitment to public policy, to advocacy. Some of you know this, the development of the moral majority. I grew up very deeply in that community. I would spend a semester in college at Focus on the Family Institute, which was, I jokingly sometimes say, not the official mission statement, to develop the next generation of the moral majority and their wives. But so I spent a semester there, and that was clearly the objective, was that we wanted to, it was at the time of the marriage amendments being brought forward to different states as a way to define marriage between a man and a woman. And public policy and advocacy was center set, actually, of Focus's understanding. So it wasn't just about actually the development of moral guidance for individual families. It was actually a recognition collectively that we wanted to influence what was happening at the highest levels of government, and that we needed to have people on the courts who would advocate for the United States being an officially Christian nation. Even though I was aware that there was a deep wedding in my community between a particular political orientation and our faith, I have to be honest, for me, I think I missed some of it, even though I kind of knew it, because I was like really into Jesus, right? Like I was like, I'm Christian because John 3:16. Like that was a big part of my own development and my own faith. And so for me, as I came of age, I started to really wrestle with this. What do I do about biblical texts that seem to not be resonant with the way that I was raised? With caring and concern, for instance, for the poor. These sorts of things, like that wasn't part of the discourse in my community as I grew up. And yet it was clearly something that God talked about a lot in the Bible. For me, this all, kind of fast forward a lot, came to head in the nomination of Donald Trump for president back in the 2016 election cycle. I have to be really honest, I was completely shocked when he was the nominee. And the reason was, I was a kid also of purity culture. Like, I was going to go to hell if I kissed a boy, okay? Like, I'm quite sure Donald Trump did a little more than kissing. I don't know. Like, that wasn't what I was told it meant to be a Christian when I was growing up, you know? And so I remember being so puzzled when the leaders of the moral majority weren't coming out against Donald Trump. And I started really wrestling with, is there something going on here that I don't quite understand? And that influenced me a lot. In the midst of that space and time, I was very aware, as I'm sure most of you are and were, that in our country, our political divide seemed to be getting more like this. And I was really wrestling with my own story and what did it mean for me to be a person of faith, a white woman who was born and raised in the suburbs, and what was my call to participate in God's kingdom as I understood it. Through all that wrestling and through prayer and discernment and the invitation of Rick Heltney, I ended up applying for a job at a church that you may have heard of before, formerly known as Colonial Church. Anyone? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And in that space, ended up coming here to work at the church. Thus, my work in the dissertation ended up being a wedding of some of my own personal wrestling with what's happening in our culture and also what we've wrestled with as a church. I want to say a little bit about our history, both more broadly as those of you who are Minnesotans. For those of you who aren't, who are on Zoom or online, I'm sorry, but you're going to learn some about the place that I love. A little bit about the history of Minnesota then and our church. I am and long have been a very proud Minnesotan. We won the Civil War because Minnesota held the hill in Gettysburg. I mean, you know, come on, people, right? Like this was my the land of lakes and water and green, and it's part of my own blood and my story. And over time, I realized that and learned, mostly actually through my friend Jim Bear Jacobs, that the story of the land that I love is actually more complicated than I realized. Because at the same time as Minnesota was fighting for the Union and sending troops to help to defend the Union cause, at the same time we were participating in the expulsion of and killing of Dakota persons here in Minnesota. And the land, indeed, which our church is even on, has been, at the time, it's Dakota land that we are on even right now. And then over time, as the Dakota were pushed out from the land, or were at a concentration camp at Fort Snelling, which I never knew as a kid, right? I went to Fort Snelling. I didn't know that was part of our history. And so once that happened, and as settlers began to move into this land that's now Edina, some of you may know that it was actually originally a pretty diverse community. part of the history of settler history on this land is that there were free blacks, and there were Quakers, and there were folks from Scotland, and folks from different places, farmers. We had some progressive transcendentalists who came and hung out in what is now Edina at the time. And it really was then what happened as the World War II ended. Edina was developed in part by the Thorpe brothers with the country club neighborhood, and some of you know this history, where then over time through in South Minneapolis and in Edina, there were racial covenants that would exclude folks who were people of color, Jewish persons from living here. And so our own church was birthed in both the post-war 1946, we beat the Nazis, we pushed back, all these evils in the world. And coming back, there's new money, there's new life and vitality and possibility. And that's part of what situates our own birth as a church. And these things are happening at the same time. Now, some of you may know and may have read, as we were wrestling with changing our name, I always had thought that the name colonial, I'd been told it referenced colonial architecture. And kind of I knew with Congregationalism, it had a broad reference to the ways in which New England, Congregationalism, all these sorts of things. And as I was reading some of the work that Christian had come across, found out that actually the selection of our name as a church from our first minister, what we had in mind when we chose the name colonial were our colonial fathers, their ideals, hopes, and prayers for the nation. Once we had that name, it solved our architectural problems. So I didn't know that was part of the origination of the original name of our church. And I bring all of this to say, both to situate and say, here's what I myself have been wrestling with, is in our particular context, what does it mean for us to be church and to be Christian? And what does that look like in view of Christian nationalism, which is a sense of, hey, we are uniquely God's people as a Christian nation, and there's not that critical relationship between our faith and what it means to be American. And over time in our own community, we wrestled with this. And as many places, we would have bunting and 4th of July celebrations. Again, do I think we shouldn't have 4th of July celebrations as Americans? No, I think we should. But these sorts of questions about how do we wrestle with what it means to be church and what it means to be American? Where's the intersections, and what happens if these things get closely wedded? So that's kind of some of my own grounding that brought me into this work and this wrestling, is what do we do as people of faith in our time? And is Christianity just about a power grab for political influence and domination, or is Christianity about something more? Okay. So in looking at this, here's the thing. Sometimes we come to these conversations and it's like nothing like this has ever been seen in the history of humanity before. Have you heard about Christian nationalism? It's terrible, everybody. It's this new thing and it's awful. It's actually not new, okay? Which I find profoundly comforting, because if something isn't new, that means other humans have wrestled with these sorts of things before, so I don't have to be that smart. So what I did in my dissertation and work is I went to a tradition that I thought could help me wrestle with what did it mean to be Christian, and it was really forming some of my own work, and then it was also forming me as I was thinking about my work in the midst of our community. And this is the tradition of political theology. Political theology, particularly in the West as it's understood, and how I've defined it in my dissertation, is really, it's the discourse and tradition that explores the relationship between the political and the theological as it relates to normative sources, moral norms, interpretive framework for making sense of the call to be and become Christian in the political or the public world. So here's the deal. Prior to Christianity's advent in the West, there's a wrestling inside of philosophy around seeking to think about the way that the religious or theological sphere influences the way that we operate and live in the political sphere. Okay, so there's wrestling with thinking about these sorts of things. And that's not a new sort of thing. You read that in the Jewish scriptures. What does it mean to be people of God? They're wrestling with these sorts of questions too. Well, in the early church, as many of you know, the early church was actually a minority religion, and it was seen as a threat to the empire because they weren't following the gods of the empire. They were saying, no, we're faithful to another God. And they were named and labeled as atheists in that context. They were persecuted and often killed. Then when Constantine became the emperor, he took on Christianity as the official religion of the state. And this question of the relationship between Christianity and the state has been a persistent one up until our time. There have been different movements at times, like with Constantine, where the wedding is almost absolute. I don't know if anyone's even seen like The Crown. It's really disorienting for me to watch The Crown and be like, wait, you're like the head of the church? I'm so uncomfortable. Okay. If you haven't watched The Crown, ignore what I just said, but I guess it's still true about, Great Britain one way or the other. But this has been a wrestling throughout history. What is to be the relationship of the church to the state? And what is the relationship of individual Christians supposed to be to the state? So in the early church, some of you know this, actually the majority opinion was that if you were Christian, you actually could not fight in the military. It wasn't okay. Is that correct, Mr. Historian? Thank you. I got a head nod. Right? And so throughout time, there's been a wrestling with what is this relationship between church and state supposed to look like. And we've seen throughout history different moments of what happens when those things get wedded together really closely. Right? Our own tradition of Congregationalism was birthed in England out of concern of how church and state was overly wedded together, right? These four movements that happen are often critiques of when they get really wedded and there's not that critical relationship. Now, basically what happens, this is a short version of history, is that through the Enlightenment becomes in many ways a deep critique of this sort of sense that government and the church, all of it rules everything, and people are now kind of having more freedom, pushing back to say, I can think for myself. There's a privatization of faith that happens at that point, where faith becomes much more private. And in response to that, what starts to happen is that there opens up some space within the broader sphere of our democratic, pluralistic relationality of thinkers for there to be diversity of thought, right? Well, we don't need to care what the Pope thinks. The Pope doesn't get to tell us what to do with our government anymore. We can wrestle with reason and think about how we want to operate. Now, in this space, and I'm going to tell you where I'm going here. In this space, there's a tradition, there's a book that's written by a legal scholar in Germany called Political Theology. And in it, what he's trying to do is he's trying to argue basically against this sort of pluralistic, diverse way of doing democratic government. He thinks it's a problem. His name is Carl Schmitt. Okay, so Carl Schmitt says, I think this is problematic. Here's what we can do, though. We can take these concepts of God and of the divine sovereign, and we can employ them for political ends to get people to go along with us. Okay, so they're trying to take these. He's taking these historic understandings of theology and of God, and now translating them to say this state itself now functions as the religion. Okay, does that make sense so far? At least somewhat. Okay. And so within that, basically his work gets employed inside of Nazi Germany. Okay. And so in response to that, you have a group of theologians who are wrestling and critiquing that and saying, this is not okay. Because what's happened is when Christianity becomes so privatized, we lose our ability to critique what's happening in the public sphere. And so we need to be engaged with and thinking about the political sphere. It matters, but not because we have all the power, but because we need to be in a critical relationship with it. So I went to this tradition because of this question about what do we do with Christian nationalism? And I knew that they were folks who had wrestled with what did it mean to be Christian in their time? What did it mean to live and move in a world in which Christianity had been co-opted for political ends? Right? And to say, not that Christianity should be about the power over, but Christians need to be concerned about what happens in the political sphere. We can't just retreat from it. We need to be invested there, and we need to wrestle and think about it. And so this is some of what then I was picking up inside of my dissertation, is looking at this tradition. And I took a look at the work, which I'm not going to go into because, time. Is I looked at the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the work of another minister and theologian, Dorothy Zola, to help me in my own thinking and my own wrestling with this. And then I took my sermons as places, and you might know some of these humans on here, as a way of saying, okay, like here's some way of having a contextual fodder to bring to life what I personally have been wrestling with you, and then making some of you wrestle with me, or inviting you kindly if you wanted to. And so I turned to my sermons as a place to do that, and I just wanted, and just so you know now where I'm coming from, as one of your ministers, for some of you, and for the rest of you, just as a random minister. One of the things that I really appreciated about the political theology tradition, the new political theology tradition, and some of where I'm coming from in my own faith, is that central in the operation of Christian nationalism, one of the main things in the image of God that is very center is God is kind of the divine sovereign, the authoritarian figure, and that often can get then translated into the political sphere as then the divine ruler who has been commissioned by God to now tell all of you what to think. And so often it goes like this, right? God the Father, the leader of the country or empire, then the leader bishops of the church, and then the bishops, and then the dads, and then all the rest of us. Okay. I'm into dads. Hello, Dad. I'm very glad you're here. Thank you. My dad, actually, I can see my dad. I'm very grateful for that. Grateful for people who rule countries. Very glad to be a minister. I also don't think that ministers have all the answers. Dads have most of them. But within this, there's this dominant image and conception of God, and thinking about God that then has been translated over to the political arena, which says that God operates as the divine sovereign, and basically our role as good Christians is that we should obey, right? If you would just obey your parents, obey your ministers, obey your leaders, and obey God, just shh, don't have any questions, okay? One of the things these theologians were saying is actually there's a big problem. When Christians have been formed to not be critical thinkers and have this privatized faith that's all about obedience to the divine sovereign, we become really problematic members of society. We follow along, we turn off our hearts, our rationality, our moral responsibility, and we need that to be reanimated. So what you'll see here about part of how I understand my work as a minister, and then it will come up in some of the images of God that I'm going to be bringing forward in just a minute. One of my major prayers and hopes as a minister is that I can help to hold space for you to have your own inner voice affirmed, valued, welcomed, encouraged, empowered. Like, that is so important to me. And it's important to me because not only do I believe in the priesthood of all believers, yay for congregationalist checkbox, but I think it's also vitally important because I don't think I'm God. So it's really important for all of us to be able to understand more of who God is through hearing from each other. That's part of the commitments of congregationalism, is that the Spirit speaks in the collective. And so we need people to have, I often say, grown-up faith, that we can be good grown-ups who can say, hey, wait a minute. This isn't okay. This isn't just. Hey, I think there's some abuse happening in our church, and this is not okay. Like, we need to be able to have those, have that be part of our life together. But too often inside of church, right, the thing is, we all think the same thing, and if you don't think the thing, there's the door, go away, question, nope, next. We've been often formed to be very obedient people. So I think one of my prayers is, as a minister, to help to hold that space. I also think that there's a role that ministers have to be prophetic, to say, hey, here's things like remember the story. Remember, because we all forget. I forget, and I need to be reminded too. And then also to help to tell the story of a community, and also to lead in that space. And so, let's see here. I don't know if I don't want to stop my share, but, oh, there. I don't know if that's the right thing. Okay, so within that, here's what I was wrestling with, and here's what I wanted to bring before you, and we can talk a little bit about. In thinking about Jesus versus Christian nationalism, if Christian nationalism really is this sense of, if you go back again to your front page, it's a cultural framework that weds together the sense that to be Christian is to be, in our context, American, and there's no critical distance or relationship there, and it's actually more about our ideology, and less actually, as we look at the data, about religious belief, practice, or about formation by Scripture. And a center to it is this image of God as the divine sovereign, where we all obey. Then I started wrestling with, okay, so what are some other images from Scripture that might help us to be formed differently? What are some ways of thinking about ourselves as Christ followers that might help us to think differently? What does it even mean to be Christian? Is there a content to being Christian? Is there something that I can say, hey, wait, this isn't okay? What's the content to that? So in this isn't exactly how it goes in the dissertation, because I thought you all might run me out of the room if I actually spoke in my dissertation language. So I'm using, but this is the underlying truth for me, is I was trying to wrestle with what does it mean for us to become Christian, which is an ever ongoing process. What does it mean for us to become and be church in the world? And loving ourselves, living from that place in response to love God, love your neighbor as yourself. What does it mean for us to do this inner work of becoming, so that way we can truly love the neighbor as we are called to do throughout the Christian scriptures? So within that, in each of the quadrants, I bring forward a different image of God that I think can help us, and some different understandings of ourselves. For those of you who've heard me preach, you've probably heard some of these themes. If you haven't, then you were sleeping through all of my sermons, which, that's cool. Or kind of sad, but it's okay. So on the sense of becoming Christian, for us as individuals, I think one of the central imaginations that can help us to become Christian, I think, is understanding the biblical concept of Yahweh God. That's the Hebrew name for God. But the concept around Yahweh is connected to the Exodus to the story of Moses with the burning bush, and persists throughout the Hebrew Bible, this image of God as Yahweh. Yahweh as the one who is the I am, the ground of being, right? So often I think that we can look for this divine sovereign who will save us, who has all the power. And the image of Yahweh is a different one. It's one of the ground of our being who holds us. And for those of you who've done work in psychology, you might know the theories of Winnicott's, where the holding space, or maybe you've heard a little bit about attachment theories. The reality is most of us didn't get everything that we needed from our parents, right? And so we have different strategies for how we seek to attach. And often our faith can be a stand-in to help us with some of the stuff that we're missing and that we need healing with. But if we're looking for the big one who's going to like smite you for hurting me and I don't feel safe, we don't say this usually, right? We don't walk around, I don't feel safe, I'm going to smash you now. Like we just act and lash out. I think an image of God that can help us is God as Yahweh, the one who's the ground of our being, who holds us, that we're safe and seen and cared for and connected to the God of the universe who is the great I am. Another aspect, particularly in our community, thinking about our own self-formation and growth, is that to replace the image in our community of pilgrims in terms of the historic, kind of fictionalized, mythologized pilgrim of old, with the notion of being persons who are on pilgrimage. Okay. What does it mean that we are people who are ever journeying with God in the life of faith? That faith isn't a thing that's back here, but it's something that opens us to the future. Early, when I was here at the church, we did a thing with Janet Hagberg's Pilgrim quilt, and Tracy Moody shared with us the Pilgrim Blessing. But it's that sense of we're people on pilgrimage, that the life of faith isn't about having all the answers, but it is instead about being on journey. The other aspect in thinking about us becoming Christian that I talk a lot about and I name in my dissertation is, what does it mean to journey the way of the cross? And the invitations we have to the wilderness and to going into the dark. German theologian Martin Luther wrote about the way of the cross versus the way of glory. This is a big aspect in Lutheran theology, which I'm stealing from for a moment. But it's this sense that so often, and I think this happens inside of Christian nationalism for us sometimes, the cross becomes the kind of powerful, the place of glory, the thing that makes me feel like everything will be okay, and I have power in that way. And Martin Luther writes about that the way of the cross is actually the way of death. It's the way not of, if you think of not by power nor by might, but by my spirit, that some of that invitation there is to journey the way of the cross. And I increasingly am a big believer that the only way for us to really understand what it means to be born again is to journey more deeply into the wilderness, to go into the dark, to the places that we're sure will kill us, and to find not the life of the flesh, as often the New Testament talks about, but of spirit. And that through that we can begin to discover resurrection. And what it means, not that we're born again as, continue to be born again as an infant, but we continue to be awakened as adult people, right? You get born again, then keep growing up. You can grow up some more and keep growing. Like, we all got to keep doing that work. So these are some of the threads that I think within scriptures that I have brought to bear a lot in the last years. Then thinking of us becoming church, I turn to the image of ruah, which again is the Hebrew idea, what's really cool of how it's breath, spirit, and life, and they all go together. This is the word for the spirit in the Hebrew Bible, and the breath, spirit, life all go together. And what we know from modern neuroscience as well is that when you quit breathing, your frontal cortex, which is your grown-up part of your brain, doesn't work so well. Also, if you completely breathe, don't breathe, you die. I get that. But breathing is important. And the spirit is that which animates life for us. And so in the dissertation, I talk about how ruah is part of our call as the church. We're to be a place of life, a place of breath, a place known and marked by spirit. And that's part of our cause. And that image, like, again, not divine sovereign. If that's the one who's like, you must do all of the right things. This one is, no, breath and life. Where's life and breath? Not control. But that image can open us up. And then what's our call? As a people of faith, to be people of promise, to be people who are about the resurrection. And the call that we have to neighbor love, to care for the stranger, to bringing about the conditions for freedom as we seek to be a people of breath. So that's some of, I think, our inner work as individuals and as community. What does it look like for us as church to be that place? And then I, in the dissertation and throughout the sermons, bring forward the ideas of El Roy, the notion of God is the God who sees, and that this becomes some of the grounding place for how we're called to relate to the neighbor. El Roy is in the story of Hagar. Hagar is a foreigner, a woman, and enslaved. She's the first person in the Bible who names God. And what does it mean that we're then called to follow God in that kind of neighbor love? That's what it means for us to love the neighbor. And this is a sense where I talk about how for us as people who are Christian, our work and our call in loving the neighbor is that we owe the neighbor something. Like, to say that we're called to love God and the neighbor isn't just some like nice words. Like, it actually asks and demands something of us. That the neighbor has rights. That we have obligations to the neighbor that are important for us to be responsible for and to take up. And that this is central to the call to be Christian. And then I also talk about how our call to be the church in loving the neighbor is rooted in the idea of Jesus as Emmanuel, God with us, right? God in the Christian narrative puts on flesh and moves into the neighborhood. If any of you are noticing any of these little threads, that was also part of a sermon series, right? Like, moves into the neighborhood. You thought it was all arbitrary. We were trying to do something. I don't know. And that the role of the church then is supposed to be about critique. And what I mean about that, and part of the challenge of Christian nationalism, is that if the church is so wedded with power, well, like, where's the critique come from? How do we know if the church or the government or anyone's getting it right or wrong? Where's any critical relationship? And so part of our work as church is actually to say, hey, what about the neighbor? Where is justice not being enacted? And that our call is to continually bring forward that vision of the God who put on flesh, that we care about all flesh ourselves. Talk about how also the kingdom is centered on Yahweh and Yahweh alone. One of the challenges in our time is that I think sometimes we lose sight of that the center of Christian faith is always supposed to be God. Right? No one else is king. No political position or party is actually the ruler. Like, the center to our faith is supposed to be Yahweh God. And that's who we serve. First and primarily, that is our call. And everything else then is held in critical relationship with that call first. And what does it mean for us to be about that as the church? And that part of the role then of the church in the world is to be the people of Jubilee. The people who announce that there's radical freedom and that there's absolutely the ways in which our world operates, but we bear witness to another kingdom in which there is peace and true shalom, and where we strive to create together the conditions of the garden. That sort of vision of Revelation where there's new heaven and new earth, that our call and our work is to help to steward that. But we don't get there by saying, and all of you will believe all of these things, and here's the rules now, the law of the land. No, our work is to help to pray and to work towards the end so that way this kingdom is available and real for folks. I ended the dissertation then by talking about how the vision we have of what it means to be the church. Let me see here. What it means. Yeah, there you go. There was all my points that I put up. How it. I ended with what it means. It matters where we start a story. Some of you know that the founding of that the arrival of the Mayflower in the United States, we often talk about Plymouth Rock. But how many of you know that actually isn't the place where the Pilgrims originally landed? Some of you do, yeah, right? It was actually originally in Provincetown. And when I had the opportunity to go to Provincetown, and I've shared this a couple summers ago, and I was there, I was going through the town, and I was there with my friend. It was that first July, right after all the major COVID lockdowns, so it was 2021. And it was like, I had not seen that many people in one place in a long time. Turns out there was a massive COVID outbreak over the weekend while I was there. But I'm walking around the town, and it was just this beautiful scene. Some of you know it's a historic space for refugees, for artists, a community for artists, for particularly gay men historically. The poet Mary Oliver lived and wrote there. And I turned around and I was like, what's this big thing in the sky? And then I found out that was actually an homage to the landing that happened there in Provincetown. And it made me think about how much it matters where we start the story and what we think the story of our faith is supposed to be about. Because Provincetown tells a different story. It's become a different community. It's one that is marked by this artistry and this freedom. And it made me wonder at what kind of story do we live as Christian people? What do we believe it means to follow Jesus? And just that our work then is to follow that call of Jesus, to be a people who aren't about the wedding of power and the sense that we have from Christian nationalism, but our call and our work is actually to be really serious about the call to love the neighbor as we love ourselves, and to help to foster the conditions where whatever people's belief, their background, etc., that we can actually have space in this country and in our world for people to be able to live together. And then our work is to become Christian ourselves and to continue that work. So that's a little bit about the work that I did in the dissertation, and I'm going to open it up for conversation. It's not question and answer because I remember I don't have all the answers, but I would welcome conversation, dialogue, etc., because I did a flyby of a lot, and I'm feeling particularly, it's weird to try to blend my dissertation with talk in the same space. So I would welcome conversation with you about anything related to this, hopefully. Please don't ask me about the twins. Oh, and Jeff Lindsay, who is our senior minister, has a microphone.
So I'm going to give all the answers.
Thank you for attending my TED Talk.
My question is, how do we as Christians learn to live with Christian nationals?
Well, I think we are, right? We are living in a space where there are folks of kind of all stripes who would answer differently to the Baylor Religious Survey. I don't have a silver bullet of what it means or how to hold space to offer critique that can be loving and heard. I think, for me, there's a couple ways I've oriented to it that I'll just share, and then if others have other thoughts of how they do that. I think one of them is actually, in part, why I haven't given up the space of my faith. I think that sometimes, and from where I came from, right, there was it was the way to be Christian. And yet I was like, but wait, I think that the Bible bears witness to some other options here. And so for me, part of what I can do is I can do the work myself to say, hey, here's the sense of how I believe Jesus is calling and showing up in my life. So I'm gonna try to be faithful to that. So that's one, because right, even in terms of if you've gone to Al-Anon, that's the part of the street I can take care of, is for sure my own inner work. And I think the other thing is that seeking to continue to be in relationship and continue to dialogue, and thank you, that was very kind, to continue to bear witness. One of the things to the world that you do believe in, to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, no, actually, I don't think so. And to have as much dialogue and conversation as you can. And beyond that, I don't have a magic. I mean, I think if someone did, we would really, I would welcome that if we had it. But I think it's continuing, that's part of why I did the dissertation, and part of why I'm here is to try to continue to bear witness. And so I think we can all do that. I hear you. And it's hard.
Answer. I don't have an answer. It's just a thought. not to consider the people as bad. The thoughts we might not agree with, but people have reasons for why they think different ways, and sometimes it helps to listen and ask questions before assuming. It's very easy to polarize these things. It's just a thought. Thank you.
Thank you for naming that. That's part of why I put in the title, Becoming Christian, because, to get biblical for a second, not that I've already attained all that or have already been made, perfect or something, right? But what does it mean that we're actually all in journey? What does it mean that to come at spaces with humility, to be able to name grief that one has? And instead of just this, what does it mean for us to also show up in ways that refuse the dehumanization of some of our political discourse? But to say, no, come be human with me. And that's also been one of I think, the harder spaces with COVID is when we couldn't actually be in space together and be reminded, hey, I'm a person too, and so are you. So I appreciate that reminder. Thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Randy.
I think empathy can be a really powerful tool in being with someone else, because most likely they're afraid. And fear is a really powerful tool that some deploy. Just fear of losing my way of life, fear of losing what I believe in, fear of losing my identity. They're afraid. Yeah. They can be very afraid, and being with that maybe is helpful.
Thank you. Yeah. I think that's real, and I think there's fear of being shamed, fear of philosophy, fear of being late, I'm an idiot, fear of, all sorts of different things. Absolutely.
I kind of grew up
being, you grew up being afraid. Yeah. Yes. Oh yeah. And if your whole life, imagine, right, for me, my own terror around, my whole life, I was told that, women who weren't submissive were going to hell. That was really hard to struggle with, and to just give some space that there's reasons, thinking about folks, I have friends who've grown up in Catholic tradition where the amount of shame that they had lived with, or being told you have to do this, of course, yeah. Sorry, who's going next? Oh, hi.
Hi, Sarah.
It's
How are you doing?
It's great to see you again.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
I have some thoughts. I enjoy your presentation, and congratulations on your dissertation.
Thanks.
I was thinking about Christian nationalism, that would it exist outside of a conservative Christianity? And I tend to think probably not. And then the question is, what is it about conservative Christianity that sort of is the fertile ground for that? And just here's some thoughts here. It seems to be sort of this binary way of thinking where there's predator and prey in this worldview, that either I'm the predator or I'm the prey. And if I'm the prey, to the comment made over there, that there's a sense of anxiety. So there's, where that comes from is a good question, but there's an anxiety that's there, that the predator is there to attack me, to take away what I have, and this and so forth, rather than looking at, say, a society where it's pluralistic, where there's not predator and prey. And conservative Christianity, that's not there. It's more of a binary view of predator and prey. Either we're in control or the predator is in control. And so the notion of the predator seems to be this notion of power, and I see a sense of theocratic leanings where this is a Christian nation, even if people don't say it explicitly, with the notion of prayer needs to be in the schools to manifest destiny, all that. And with the election of Trump in the previous election was this notion of make America great again, which has many meanings, but one of them is to make this theocratic nation. So that notion of the predator, if it were flipped over, would be a notion of power. In this way, it would be theocratic. Christians would be in control. It would be anti-pluralistic, where it's just Christian values that dominate the landscape. And there would be this total control with no ambiguity at all. Even in theological circles, there could not be any ambiguity about what God is doing. So I see this more in Reformed traditions, if we go back far enough, with the way Calvin saw God, that everything is clockwork. But a narrative that has that does away with this binary way of looking at things, where it's a pluralistic society, the tension I see there is, well, that means we're in dialogue with people that are not Christians, right? Aside from the notion of conservative and liberal Christians, but the notion that there are others who may come to the table and share thoughts about how society should go and so forth. I think even there's room for dialogue there, because ultimately God is in control of all creation, and truth can come from outside the church itself. And if we think that way, there wouldn't be that predator-prey sort of mindset, and that would do away with a lot of the anxiety that a lot of Christians have. But I think the anxiety comes out of a conservative way of thinking. You don't really see that. And so the liberal branch of the church, that kind of is very pluralistic. So just some thoughts. I've been thinking about this topic for a while. But thank you for the presentation.
Thank you for sharing very much. Yeah. Other folks? Yeah, Jackie.
Can you speak to wokeness, and what is your perception of what that is?
Yeah, I think one of the things holistically in our time is we have different ways or language that gets utilized or employed that it's hard for us to then hear one another, right? So I think right now wokeness is a way of, I think, naming some folks, and there's a whole, right, this room itself is a pretty diverse group of folks in terms of what you all think. I don't know what you all think, right? But sometimes right now we like to label and box everyone like, okay, you're one of the hat people. We all know what all hat people think, right? And that's, we got another one. We got another one in the house, right? And so there's a sense in which I understand the term wokeness is utilized and employed towards folks who have various levels of sense that, hey, you need to be thinking about this thing. I want to be on the front edge of saying this thing is unjust. It depends on, but it's right now, I think, being employed more so to say that there is a group of people who are captured by that. And I would want us to have more of a dialogue about, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Like, what are concerns that someone might have about wokeness? Why might someone say, oh, that's actually important to me? So for me, kind of if I move apart from the wokeness as a thing, I like to think about as a Christian person, what does it mean for me to be continually reawakened? What does it mean that part of the call of my faith is that there's ways I've gone to sleep. There's things I don't see. And we see this as a biblical invitation to tons of folks who encounter Christ, is where suddenly their eyes are open and they're awakened in a new way. And so that's for me personally as a Christ follower, something that I like to take to heart is, guess what? There's things that I didn't know yesterday that today, by hearing someone else's story, it opens me in a new way. And so I try to be careful about those sorts of things where it's like, this is that, and, well, we know all Republicans think this, and all of this. So, yeah, that would be my thought. Thanks
it's
for...
very Christian. Once was lost, was blind, but now I see. It's
Yeah.
a very Christian
and speaking
notion of...
And you know where that hymn came from, right? The hymn Amazing Grace was written by a man who had participated in the slave trade, and God awoke him in a new way to seeing the horrors of what he had done. So when he says, and now I see, Like he was like, what have I participated in? And wrote Amazing Grace. Yeah. Mary.
Hey, Sarah.
Hi.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the persistence of this kind of Christian nationalism. You reminded me of how far back it goes. And it seems like it's a cycle that humans
are going to human.
Humans are going to human. We're going to, but that this seems to be a way that we address our anxiety, that we address our the fear that is so normal and human. Yeah. What is it about us? What is it about this kind of philosophy that makes it so persistent?
Thanks for naming that, and I think that resonates some of what you were sharing, Bernard, with the sense of. So for me, this is part of why I'm such a huge advocate of us doing inner healing work, and why it's a big commitment of myself to do. Why I've gone to therapy for so many years, is because I think that we all grow up in family systems and in the world that's broken. And we experience things that harm us. And a lot of us, then as we age, we get interested in ego preservation and in staying safe in the world. No judgment, I do that too. Right? And, part of the good news from my seat of Jesus is that Jesus is like, hey, you're loved. Lay it down. Come follow me. That there's these invitations into the rhythm of life, and to not having to say, I have to get what's mine. I have to stay in power. Not surprisingly, though, that actually the call of faith, of Christian faith, is a pretty vulnerable, right? The stuff it actually asks, if you're like, oh, I have to, what? I don't know if, That's how I talk about it. and so I get it. I get it that throughout history and up until today, it's a lot easier to reach for identities that will give me power, that will make me feel safe. And so I think you see that both in the individual level and also on societal levels, and in the movement of church, where we lose our way and we get stuck on power, and it becomes an addictive thing that kills us. And then we do it and we slap Jesus on it, This is one of the things, my dad and I actually talk a lot about this. My dad's part of a community of bloggers who write a lot about abuse in the church and cover-up of it. And it just is mind-blowing to me how, someone can say, hey, my kid got abused at church, and then how people will turn on them. But it's because there's so much wrapped up often for us, I think, in trying to stay safe and feel like I'm part of and I'm attached to the power figure. I mean, even high school psychology, where I'm going to cozy up with a cool football player, and then everyone's going to think I'm cool and not a nerd, right? That happens in our spirituality. And I think the invitation of Jesus is to actually become human, to become alive, and that there's enough for all of us, right? And so we continue, the Spirit keeps on, in my Christian understanding, right, keeps on breathing and inviting and challenging us to lay it down and to rediscover life. Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
Could you share your thoughts, research, whatever, on the other side of the coin that you mentioned before about the nationalist view in the church, where it is now being used by the media, by politicians, to reach into that wellspring of voters. There was an NPR piece last weekend highlighting the number of ministers in conservative areas that are leaving their flocks because they cannot compete. They say, I think the quote was, Fox News has them for 10 to 15 hours a day. I only have them for 1 hour a day, and I can't fight that.
Now I could just weep.
You too?
Yeah. This has been I almost at one point had a chapter on, like, what do you do when it fails? Like, what do you do? I felt like in the last number of years, like, I felt like I couldn't scream more about, like, hey, like, let's become Christian, and I was like, people are, let's, like, I'm like, I actually believe in this, like, and yet watching how, like, I was like, I cannot combat the noise of our whole lives. And the formation, part of it in here, I talk about the call to discipleship, and I know this is a real passion of Christians too, like the call to Christian formation and discipleship. Because actually, a lot of what gets to pass as Christian discipleship has nothing to do with, like, you're like, what? In what Bible verse did you find that? You're like, I don't know what you're talking about. But so much of our lives, like, we are formed, and I'm not saying it just is. Like, we exist in culture and time. But the challenge is when, again, we can't have a critically reflective relationship with that, and stuff gets baptized or sanctioned as just Christian, when it's actually about more of a cultural norm or something that we've come to embrace and label as Christian, that's often much more fraught and complicated. And so I think there is major ways in which, and it's pretty alarming to me to watch how there is a co-opting that's happening. And you see ministers who, right, like, even when we're talking about COVID closures, like, some folks, so, like, I know that there are people who didn't close because they knew they would lose money. They knew it wasn't going to be helpful for the health and well-being of their congregants, but they knew that in our political environment, that was the right pragmatic decision for money, right? So these sorts of things, and I don't have the answer for how to change that, except for to say, hey, folks, let's keep leaning in. And for me to keep saying, and then I'll shut up here, because I know, Fran, I see you. But also, one of the challenges, and this is the one time I get to say this, so forgive me the space. Like, one of the most challenging perception of myself in the last number of years and through our name change was that there were some folks who I know believed that I was just this political liberal who was here at our church to try to, like, bring some democratic political liberal agenda. And I was like, listen, I might have political opinions. You have political opinions, sure. But let's be Christian together. Like, that's what I'm actually interested in. Like, when I'm talking about justice, it's because I feel like I read it a couple times in the Bible. I don't know. I'm just saying. Right? And so this is one of the things that I think to keep wrestling with for all of us, to just notice, like, when I hear you say something, am I interpreting you through, like, what lenses and what's operative for me? And that's kind of all I got. Yes, Fran.
I like the statement about wanting to talk to others, but I really don't see any intentionality in that. You have to be really intentional about wanting to hear other point of views. We say it all the time. It sounds nice, and that's where probably woke happens. People, ooh, I'm so woke. I talk to a black person or whoever it is, or whatever it is, and that really means nothing at all. The other thing is that, and this is not really a popular view among white people, but I will say we do a lot of spoon feeding of white people. Ooh, is the pablum too warm? Is it too cool? Is it whatever? And I'm of the opinion of just, like, take it the way you get it. Because you really are not going to get it any other way. How many hundreds of years have we been at this crap? Over and over, and people are still going, how do I do this? What do I do? Really? You know what it is to I sit back here and I'm so frustrated because I'm like, you all can't not know. You know. So why is it not being done?
Thank you.
You guys interact with other communities that you donate money to and you work with. I'm going to assume they're not white.
Some,
The ones that are not, hey, there's a community. You can actually engage and talk to them. It's pretty dang easy if you go. People want to talk. But we're not going to come to you and talk to you anymore because we're sick and tired of it.
Yeah.
I mean, people are just really exhausted. People are just exhausted, that's all. But Sarah.
Thanks, Fran. Thanks for sharing. Oh, I could, I can share my, I'm sorry. I'm just like acting like the microphone's glued to my chin, so sorry about that.
It is good.
Yeah.
She took so long to get up here, I can't remember what I was going to say.
No.
Hey.
I think that...
Hi, Glenn.
And this all kinds of ties in with the original question was how do we get along with Christian nationalists? I think we have to be ourselves. We can't let someone else set the agenda for my life. I have decided, because I have family and friends that I have to deal with, I am going to continue to be grateful and as generous as I can be and as inquisitive as I can be with everybody. I can't let them set the agenda for me and how I'm going to live out my faith. And historically, that's got to be the way it is. I mean, in 1850 or so, there was a yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia. And the argument over how to take care of yourself, how to take care of that outbreak, was bloodletting, because that was medicine at the time. Do you bloodlet a lot or just a little bit? And that argument fell along political party lines. The issue of bloodletting, a lot of bloodletting was, one party, a little bit of bloodletting, well, that was the other party. And there were big fights about that in the newspaper and on the streets. Nothing is new. Nationalism has been around, going way back. I mean, this is not a new thing. And I think for us as people of faith, we just need to be people of faith. That's how we live with other folks. I think I have to be gracious.
Yep.
I have to be grateful. I have to be generous, and I have to be inquisitive. Jesus asked way more questions than he was ever asked.
Yeah.
We're not going to change minds, but we can change hearts by continuing to develop relationships. As difficult and as painful as that may be, we're not going to change minds. And I don't know that it's up to us.
Yeah.
But I think we can change hearts by continuing to develop and keep relationships. I think that's the only way I'm going to live. I don't know about them, but that's the only way I can survive and live in this culture right now and at this time. So it's really, we have to set the agenda for ourselves. You're responsible for yourself. I have to set the agenda for myself in those relationships and not let them set the agenda for me.
Yeah, thanks.
Because they can trigger me in a minute if I let them.
Yeah. Well,
but I don't want them to, because I've done that and it hurts and it was horrible and I still live with the pain of that.
Yeah.
So I have to set the agenda for myself, and that's for me, out of my faith, to be generous, to be grateful, and to be inquisitive.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. Some of you know that I had shared this in our community. When we had first voted on name change. And the no was really painful for me. And I felt a lot of grief because for me it was situated in a sense of my own desire that our name wouldn't be an impediment and it wouldn't be harmful and that we would reckon with that history. And in the days after, I was curled up in a ball crying. And just felt a lot of grief, was thinking about the history of Christianity and when we've lost sight of, I think, the call not to crusade but to love. And that was when I've shared that song that came to me, which was the Give Me Doubt. And it's the give me doubt so I can love my neighbor as myself. Give me doubt so I can lay all my weapons on the ground. When the armor of God is too heavy for peace, give me doubt. And that sense of let everything I do at least be trying to be rooted in love And to recognize that, like I've said a lot of times, I don't have all the answers. It's not like I'm like, well, good thing. Like yesterday I was a really bad person, but now I'm not. You know, but how do I maintain an open humanity to be able to be in relationship and be challenged and to grow myself always? So thanks. Hi. It's really good to
Sarah.
see you. Can I say who you are?
Sure, go ahead.
This is Jim Bear Jacobs, who will be leading our Sacred Sites tour, co-leading that on October 29th, who is also a dear friend and a leader in our broader community and is also the reason that I'm still here. So thank you for your presence.
I hear this talk and this inquisitive nature about how we live with Christian nationals. And as a Native man, I just need to name that that is a privilege that is afforded largely this room. We know Christian nationalism is directly tied to white supremacy. We just have to name that. And I apologize, I came late to your presentation, so forgive me if I'm restating things. But Christian nationalism is directly tied to white supremacy. It is an attempt to preserve the white power that is the atmosphere we breathe. And as a person of faith, as a pastor myself, I totally understand this impulse to love Christian nationalists into the kingdom of God and welcome them into the family. But the thing is also, we as a church are called to be prophetic. We are called to be pastoral, but we are called to be prophetic. And we see this when, when the Christian flag is marched into the Capitol building on January 6th, and people with guns are following that. You know what I think of? I think of Peter picking up the sword and cutting off the ear of the Roman soldier, and Jesus rebukes him and says, Satan, get behind me.
Yes. Yep. Yeah.
I've been working in these circles for so long. And I'm just going to speak honestly. I don't have the optimism that our churches that wrap themselves in the American flag and believe that Jesus defends and supports the Constitution of the United States, I'm sorry, but they are not Christian. They are not Christian. And there's a very wonderful author, Soon-Chan Ra, when he talks about the American church, he says, you know what? When it comes to the American church and all of the white supremacy that gets embedded into the American church, we need to stop pretending we're sitting hospice for the church, and we need to just prepare for the funeral. And when the funeral happens, we are people of resurrection, and let's resurrect something beautiful. Let's resurrect a community that lives the call of Jesus, right? That kenosis that says we can live empty of power, empty of scarcity mentality, and when we see models of this, we suppress it. I mean, I'm a veteran of Standing Rock in 2016. And you know why Standing Rock was such a threat? You know why we got sheriff's departments from around the country and militarized police? You know why they shut it down? Because we were showing the world there's a better way to live. There is a way in which we live in community. We police ourselves. We care for one another. We educate our children in the way. We do all of this. There is a way in which we move out of this scarcity mentality that, by definition, we have to protect and preserve the vestige of power that whiteness holds on to. And we were showing the world there's a different way. We were living more Christian than those maniacs who barge into the Capitol.
Thank you.
And what happens, they're treated with pretty much kid gloves, right? People were dying there. And they turned the water cannons on us, and the tear gas, and the dogs, and yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for naming that. Yeah, a couple things. You know, the one is, I think that's where naming, when I had said the role of the preacher is prophet, too, because sometimes I think to what you're naming, we can say love, and even as I sing that song, that doesn't mean that I'm like, oh, just love, and right? Like that there is a sense as we read the Christian scriptures, that is a central call, is that the prophet shows up all the time and says, you know what? I don't want your religious sacrifice. You know what I want? I want you to care about the poor, the needy, and those who are oppressed. And that's the continual call of the prophet that happens, and that's to all of us. I think my challenge, and particularly, and I name this, is that it's easy for me to suddenly be like, well, good that I'm a good white person. You know, like I've arrived. And to say, no, like, am I committed to, do I think like you're the enemy? No, I think this system and the thing that's broken us all, that's the enemy. Like, that's the problem. And can I see and still cognize humanity to say, come join me in the land of being human? And I'm stealing that from Audre Lorde and MLK. So, like, you know, like, you know, to be able to continue. I just thank you for naming. That's important. And thank you for sharing that. And thank you for your presence.
Sarah, we have a question from Garrett Wright, who's watching on YouTube. He's wondering, you shared a little bit about your kind of transformation, going from one way of thinking to kind of where you are at now. Kind of a two-part question. Have you had any impact on your family or folks from your history, and kind of challenging and encouraging them in their journeys? And then kind of part two alongside of that is, are there any like tangible strategies to minister to people and kind of help them see things in a different light?
The one is, sorry, I had that. The question was about like my family and relationships, basically, right? Have I impacted any of them? I don't know. You have to ask some of them. No, I'm just kidding. I would say, yeah, and actually this was first really painful in my family, and not holistically, but I think I knew even, I mean, when I told my grandma that I wanted to be a preacher, my grandma goes, well, women can't preach. You know, so my grandma ended up in the front row when I was preaching. So that's Grandma Joey. I think, you know, as a family, we've wrestled. I've appreciated that some of my family has like held space when they didn't quite know what to do with me. I've also had different family members reach out and say, you being honest about where you're at has helped me to be honest about where I'm at. And I would say I have one familial relationship that's pretty painful. Yeah, so I don't know that I have any, it's kind of a normal human story probably of family relationships that way. And then strategies. Practical strategies for what?
Kind of ministering to those people, like people that have those differing opinions, helping them kind of see things.
I had a thought. Yeah. I had a thought and I don't know where it went. So, thank you. I'm sorry for not being a more helpful question answerer.
You said that when you were talking about we were talking about the listening and being open and being curious.
Yeah, but there's there was something else I was thinking about though, and it went away. So I'll come back to you if I have brain power again. You had a question though, and then I'll think.
Is there anything that you learned in your research about the relationship between Christian nationalism and the rejection of science? And what does that mean to you as a Christian and someone who I presume believes in science?
Surprise! Oh, I do. But I actually grew up where I didn't. Like, science was a lie. My science teachers were lying. I would get in arguments with them. Regularly. I was just looking at this because I was pulling up. So in the text, the Whitehead one, Taking Back America Back for God, they they actually do some work looking at the what are kind of the key indicators for if someone will show up as Christian nationalist, and there's like 3 or 4 different subcategories that will tend to then give evidence that someone will probably answer really strongly in the Christian nationalists, and one of them is actually quote-unquote literal interpretation of the Bible. So it's someone who would say, I believe in a 7-day creation, I reject learnings or kind of from outside sources of psychology or science, etc. Things like that would be one of the indicators. Yeah. Did I miss part of your question? Oh, does that mean anything to me as a Christian? Well, I think I'm a big, right now I'm a big all truth is God's truth person, and that's kind of part of what I love about, like, as I learn about psychology and neuroscience, it's really cool then to get to kind of reapproach my faith and think about spirit and breath, and I'm like, I love that stuff, right? Where you're like, oh my goodness, the learning over here, and not that everything is, oh my gosh, and there's no tension ever about anything. But it helps me to open up, and I think my faith gets to come alive in new ways as I learn about other cultures, other contexts, other disciplines. It just, I think, makes me, I love that. And it's one of my favorite things, actually, about being here, is getting to have those dialogues together. So, yes, sir? Well, I understand Christian nationalism is kind of... Is your mic on? Jeff, turn the mic off for the moderator.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, no doubt. But, Christian nationalism, the kind of taking over, usurping, the word is escaping me, religious faith and tradition to support political views, to make them, to combine them so that you're in part saying, this is God's wills, and that's fine. But I take it that, many people, in, for example, deciding how to vote, think, I should vote the way I think things should be. Yeah. And for many people on many issues,
this is a good question.
I think one of the reasons I think how things should be, help the poor, reduce discrimination, save the environment, a whole host of things.
Yes.
Christians may believe because of their Christian faith, whereas secular people might hold some of the same views. But I don't think you're saying religion should be completely divorced.
Set aside your Christianity when you vote, everybody. No.
So is it just
to be clear? Please don't cut off.
Are you just talking about about institutions that people should be individually deciding, and whatever your reason for voting, whatever, to protect the environment is just fine, but don't say. We don't want to go the other way, where views that some people would list as liberal are said to be, well, that's the way it's got to be, and God requires that. And there's a danger
Jesus
in some
used
public
to be
discourse.
a Republican, but now I know he's a Democrat.
And
we're good. Right. No, and because then, the cross still loses its critique, right? No, I really appreciate that. I deeply hope that your faith, if you're a person of faith, influences the whole of your life, okay? Let that be clear. I very much hope that for all of us. But I actually hope that too, by the way. Meaning we sometimes say that, but it's actually, it comes out differently. I think, and even to what Jim Bear brought up, which is part of at the heart of Christian nationalism, if you go back to the definition as it's talking about what is Christian nationalism, it's a cultural framework, collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, value systems that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity and American civil life that includes assumptions of nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, along with divine sanction for authoritarian control and militarism. Okay, I could do it faster. So that's what I'm critiquing, is the way in which Christianity, gets wedded with power, but it actually becomes the cloak that disguises and gives credence to all sorts of beliefs that are profoundly un-Christian. Like the idea to the manifest destiny thing, right, that you brought up, Bernard, of the what happens when I believe that God has given America a manifest destiny that is above and beyond anything, and it gives me carte blanche power to become a colonial power in the world, to then say all those other people, they're not actually equally created in the image of God to me, and I'm going to come over and now tell them how to do all the things. Like, these are the sorts of things that Christian nationalism, that's part of the critique here, is to say, what's imbued within or part of Christian nationalism are these assumptions that are actually profoundly problematic, and they're rooted in things that led to the support of genocidal behavior, right? God is uniquely on my side. I can now go crusade and eradicate. Where did you get that idea from, Jesus? I mean, really? That's what the critique is to say the ways in which, as we look at both our own history and time, where in the name of Jesus, right? If you've read White Too Long from Robert P. Jones, he starts off, he has this chapter where he talks about folks, right? They're at church, and then they go to a lynching. I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? Like, that's the critique. Like, please, let your faith challenge how you vote, how you show up. But if I heard any of you, including me, say, well, I'm a Christian, so those folks, they should just die in the desert if they think they should get, refuge here or something, right? Okay, not a Christian option. That's like not a Christian position. That is a political position in our world. Now, do I personally think Christians of good faith are going to wrestle and come to different perspectives on how to deal with borders in a complicated world? Yep. Absolutely. And that's part of the beauty of our political system at its best, is that we're supposed to come together to wrestle with hard things. But as Christian people, wherever we end up, should we ever lose sight of some central truths that God has made everyone in God's image? Like, how does the Bible challenge what I think politically? So does that make sense, that nuance to say, I hope our faith influences. And let's just be careful and critical and reflective about the ways in which, in the name of Jesus, we wholesale can have an operation of something else that's actually going on, which is about power. Okay, and then we should wrap up, because I'm not great at time, but I think
obviously the concern is where this leads to, all these bad things. But it would seem to me it would still be objectionable if the other side, who were in favor of only those things I thought were good things, melded their religion with the government and said, this is how it should be politically, even if I agreed with what they were in favor of.
So I would also, so say for instance, and in the definition of Christian nationalism, as we're talking about, there's a particular thing that's operative. Now, say that Sara believes that Sara has a utopian solution to all of the things, and if you all just joined my little kingdom, it would be really great, and I'm going to rule everything, right? I still think there's going to be profound problems. Sure, absolutely. I think we should always be careful and cautious about thinking that any political system is going to save the day. And that if we can just have a utopian Jonestown, well, I'll be just fine. Drink the Kool-Aid, it's cool. Right? But the role of the church should always be in critical relationship. But also, what's the content of what it means to be Christian, right? That whenever the church loses sight of that, the role that we have in society, our goal is to be people who love God and love our neighbors. That we're supposed to let Scripture deeply influence how we show up, to care, to be present in the world, these sorts of things. The reality is we often throughout history have lost sight of that in radical ways, even up until today. And that's part of what I wanted to challenge, is to say, let's lean in to get challenged anew by the text and tradition of our faith, and to be able to wrestle together with, am I reacting about this because of what I'm hearing from political or news sources, and am I getting defensive because of that? Or is it because something's going on that within Scripture that's challenging me and in my faith tradition? Anyway, yeah.
I think we should. There's always going to be one more question.
I'm not going to die after this, hopefully. Here. So if you want to talk more afterwards, we can.
And I would suggest that you do. There's probably a couple other hands that were just going to go up. I think, first of all, we should thank Sara for sharing the work that she has done in preparing for today and working on her dissertation.
Thank you.
Clearly has come out of your life, and you mentioned a lifetime. I hope not yet. You still have a whole lot of life left.
Well, all the life I have so far.
It's come out of, and you've been thinking about
That's
it, percolating
a
it, and your work here was in formulating your own understanding of your faith, your relationship with God in the world that you live in, but also the world that you'd like to see happen.
Yep.
And so, as good congregations, we're grateful for your sharing of your thoughts and how you're discerning that, who helps us then wrestle with the ways that we think about that as well. Yep. And to create a safe place for us to come to the table to have that conversation. So thank you for creating that space, and for Christian, you having this series that helps us to do that. One of the things that I would just say, as I've thought about what you've shared, one of the things I think you would be most sad about for somebody to walk away from this going, oh, I've got a new term to use to point a finger at somebody else.
Please do that. Yeah.
You just gave me another definition where I can categorize and separate myself and stuff. The whole point of the gentleman, was it Glenn, that was sitting here was to say, we should enter into this conversation over this great divide with curiosity and questions and invitation and the love that Jesus, as good Christians, has given us. That's where we're supposed to lead first. If we're leading with love, we're going to end up in a place where we probably can have some kind of dialogue. We can still end up disagreeing, but we can at least have civil conversation around it. So grateful for you to share in this in the context in which you did. And I mean, the conversation continues, right? The conversation continues. So I thought it'd be great if we could just maybe close in a prayer, asking God to continue to lead us in the midst of this, and to, as followers of Jesus, if that's what you are, to be led by God's Spirit and helping us to discern the path forward. So God, thank you for this time. Thank you for this space. Thank you for this chance for us to gather as people interested in a world that you came into, Jesus, to show us the way. And thank you for the promise of the Spirit that promises to be with us, to lead us, to give us clarity and discernment and wisdom and understanding and patience and hope and peace and love that should overflow into the relationships that we cross paths with. We pray that we might get closer to that, what your desire is for this world, your creation, and all that means. Celebrating the humanity of all and the precious gift that they are to us, whether we recognize it or not. Pray that you would continue to draw us into this conversation, that we might be formed by your Spirit in a world that needs to understand what it means to be your followers. So God, go before us and prepare the way. Thank you. Bless Sara in her work and in her ministry amongst us. For we pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all for
thank you so much.
Being here tonight.
And allegedly, all 300 plus pages will be on Loyola eCommons for your download availability at some point. Stay tuned.
And I'm selling the dictionaries that will go with it. So come see me about that.